Imagine standing in a silent limestone cavern, thousands of feet below the surface of the Siberian permafrost, and finding a finger bone that shouldn't exist. It isn't quite human, but it isn't an animal either. It's something caught in the static between the two, a biological ghost that hasn't seen the sun in 50,000 years. We are taught to believe the story of humanity is a straight line, a clean progression from the dust of the earth to the people we see in the mirror today. But the deeper we dig, the more the dirt starts to lie to us. The dirt tells us that for the vast majority of our time on this planet, we were never alone. There is a disturbing silence in the book of Genesis that we usually walk right past because the alternative is too difficult to process. We read about Adam, and then we skip to the flood, assuming the world in between was just a primitive version of our own. But the archaeological record is screaming something different. It's telling us about the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and the Flores hobbits, creatures with our hands, our eyes, and perhaps our capacity for worship, yet they are nowhere to be found in the genealogy of the saved. If God made man in his image, who made the others? And this is where it gets uncomfortable. When you look at the skull of a Neanderthal, you aren't looking at a monkey man from a textbook. You're looking at a heavy-browed, barrel-chested survivor that was stronger than any modern athlete. They buried their dead with flowers. They cared for their elderly. They had the spark of something sentient. Yet in the biblical timeline, they seem to occupy a space that doesn't exist. Some theologians call it the Pre-Adamic gap, a period of chaos where the earth was tohu vabohu, without form and void. But what if that void wasn't empty? What if it was crowded with things that looked like us, but lacked the specific breath of life that defined the line of Adam? The fossil record shows us a world teeming with these ghost lineages, species that lived alongside our ancestors, traded with them, and in some dark corners of history, interbred with them. Genetic testing proves that most of us carry their DNA in our blood right now. We are a walking graveyard of species that God seemingly chose to forget. It makes you wonder if the mighty men of old mentioned in Genesis 6 weren't just tall humans, but something fundamentally different, a biological anomaly that the biblical text treats with a mixture of awe and absolute horror. But here's the problem. If these species were sentient, if they could love and feel pain and scream at the sky, why weren't they on the ark? Why does the biblical narrative act as a divine filter, straining out every branch of the human tree until only one remains? We often talk about the Nephilim as the fallen ones, the offspring of heaven and earth, but perhaps the term is broader than we think. Maybe the monsters of the ancient world weren't green-skinned beasts, but the heavy-breathing, red-haired Neanderthals who watched the ark being built from the shadows of the trees, knowing they didn't have a ticket. Think about the sheer loneliness of that realization. Scientists recently discovered a species in the Philippines called Homo luzonensis. They were small, agile, and completely distinct. They lived, they survived, and then they vanished. In the biblical framework, these aren't just extinct animals, they are spiritual enigmas. If they weren't part of the Adamic covenant, then what were they? Were they a prototype discarded by the Creator, or were they the living souls that resulted from a world that had gone terminally wrong before the first word of Genesis was even written? No, seriously, think about this. If you go to the caves of Gibraltar, you find the last campfire of the Neanderthals. They were there, huddled around the heat, just as the climate began to turn. At the same time, across the world, modern humans were beginning to dominate. The Bible describes a world before the flood as being filled with violence, a word that in the original Hebrew suggests a tearing of the natural order. We usually think of that as people being mean to each other. But what if the violence was biological?
What if the corruption of all flesh meant that the very blueprint of humanity was being hacked, spliced, and distorted by forces we don't understand? The Book of Enoch, which many of you know describes the period before the flood in terrifying detail, mentions that the fallen angels didn't just teach men war, they sinned against the birds and the beasts and the reptiles and the fish. It describes a total ecological and genetic nightmare. When we find these goblin humans in the fossil record, the ones with the strange teeth and the warped limb proportions, are we looking at the natural progress of evolution, or are we looking at the crime scene of the Watchers? Are these the monsters that the Earth tried to bury? And it gets stranger when you look at our own blood. If these species were truly monsters or demonic, why did God allow their DNA to survive in us? Somewhere between 1 and 4% of your genome is Neanderthal. You carry the mark of the other inside your very cells. If the flood was intended to wipe out the corruption of the old world and start fresh with Noah, why did the genetic ghost of the extinct humans hitch a ride? It implies that the clean slate wasn't as clean as we were led to believe. But here is where the logic starts to break. In the 19th chapter of Genesis, there's a fleeting, terrifying mention of the monsters of the desert. In the original texts, the words used are seirim, goat demons or hairy ones. The ancient Hebrews were terrified of the wild men who lived in the wastes. We've always dismissed these as myths, but as we continue to find more species like the Denisovans, we have to ask if the mythology was actually just a very late, very frightened observation of the last survivors of a dying branch. Imagine being an early Israelite and seeing a creature that looks human but moves with the strength of a bear and speaks in a tongue that sounds like grinding stones. You wouldn't call it a cousin, you'd call it a demon. But the twist isn't that these species existed. The twist is why they stayed hidden so long. For thousands of years, we lived in a comfortable bubble, believing we were the only ones ever invited to the party. Now the ground is literally opening up and handing us the evidence that we were the ones who moved into a house that was already occupied. And the occupants didn't just leave, they were evicted. Think about the sea serpents or the giants you've heard about in legends. We treat them as separate from humanity. But if you saw a Homo erectus today, a creature that walked upright for 2 million years, mastered fire, and hunted elephants with wooden spears, you wouldn't see an animal, you'd see a man. And yet, if that man stood before the gates of the garden, would he be let in? Or was he part of the beasts of the earth that were created on a different day for a different, darker purpose? And this is where it gets truly uncomfortable. If you accept that these other humans had souls, or at least a version of them, you have to accept that the history of salvation is much narrower than we imagined. It suggests a creator who is comfortable with experimental lineages that are allowed to burn out in the cold. It suggests that the second type of human wasn't a mistake, but a warning of what happens when the image of God is mimicked but not inhabited. We are left with a world that is essentially a graveyard of failed attempts. We walk over the bones of the Denisovans every day, never realizing that they might have been the original inhabitants of the places we now call holy. There's a specific kind of dread in realizing that the monsters of the Bible might have just been our brothers who weren't chosen. So when we look at the timeline of Genesis 6 and we see the world being swallowed by water, we have to wonder who was screaming the loudest. Was it the humans who had turned their backs on God? Or was it the things that never had a chance to know Him in the first place? The Bible tells us that Noah was perfect in his generations, a phrase that many scholars believe refers to his genetic purity. If Noah had to be pure, it means everyone else was something else. As the ice melts and the caves of the world give up more bones, we are going to find more of them. We are going to find things that look even more like us and things that look like our nightmares. We will categorize them, name them in Latin, and put them in glass cases, but we will never be able to answer the one question that matters. When the rain started to fall and the fountains of the great deep were broken up, did those other humans try to swim? Or did they already know that the world they belonged to had ended a long time ago? We like to think we have all the answers, but the truth is, we are just the one species that was allowed to tell the story. And the story we tell is always the one that makes us the heroes. But the dirt remembers the others.